Okay. Um, so we also invite all your questions. Please look at the Q&A chat box on your screen. If you think of any question for a speaker at any point, just type it in there and we will go through them in the Q&A portion at the end of the event. Without further ado, I will now pass on the mic to Dr. Fahad Turki, the chair of T20 Saudi Arabia and vice president of research at CAPSARC. Dr. Fahad, please.
Thank you, Johara. Ladies and gentlemen, partners, friends, and colleagues, it's a pleasure to connect with you today. I would like to thank you for attending the T20 webinar today to discuss thought leadership in turbulent times, and also to allow us to introduce our new task force, the 11th task force on COVID-19, entitled Multidisciplinary Approach to Complex Problems. At the T20, we started the work to prepare for this special task force in early March, when signs of the danger of this virus has started to emerge. Since then, COVID-19 has spread to more than 3 million people in over 183 countries, a rate of infection that has never been seen in more than a century. While it took the virus 3 months to spread to 500,000 people, it took 8 days for that number to double to 1 million. And also, in addition, 13 days to reach 2 million cases. Such rate of infection has already taken an enormous toll on public healthcare system, society, the market, and the economy. So even strong and well-funded healthcare systems are struggling to respond to the virus, even with the strict social distancing measures. While the socioeconomic impact of the pandemics are very clear. Global economic growth are turning into the negative territory, and unemployment are soaring in many countries. SMEs are getting out of business. Inequalities are deepening. And we are unable to meet the needs of the most vulnerable households, including the elderly and vulnerable citizens in many places. We should learn from previous crises, where global unity and solidarity should be the top of our priorities. Countries with robust social protection systems suffered least and recovered most quickly and should stand ready to support less fortunate countries. As we highlighted in 3 T20 statements since early March, we need urgent investments in critical public services and public goods to first suppress the virus and to minimize the social and economic impact of the pandemic, and to recover better with a more sustainable and resilient society and economic models. As we transition toward a gradual reopening in the weeks and months ahead, we should assess the path forward for society, markets, and the economy. And also we should contemplate what life after COVID-19 may look like for individuals, businesses, and geopolitical models globally. Nothing about reopening the economy will be easy, but restarting businesses will be a lot more simpler than restating confidence and restarting aggregate demand. The COVID-19 pandemic is a harsh reminder of our common fate and of the need for immediate investment action to reduce the risk of adverse social and economic implications. So I believe now more than ever before that multilateralism and coordinated international actions are vital. To this end, the T20 has issued 3 statements since early March to the leaders of the G20, before and after their extraordinary summit that was held at the end of March. In this statement, we called for a coordinated stimulus package to allocate resources to businesses, workers, and households, especially in less developing countries. These would include physical stimulus, scaling up cash transfer measures, social protection, tax reduction, low interest rate, access to credit, restoring global supply chain, reversing slowdown in global trade, improving access to medical supplies, And last but not least, insurance and wage support schemes for especially for SMEs and in less developing countries. Ladies and gentlemen, this event is yet another testament to the importance of the think tank community and the think tank contribution to meeting global challenges such as COVID-19. So I encourage you all to actively participate in this webinar and contribute to the T20 process by maintaining our mandate of providing unbiased, research-based policy recommendations to the decision makers of the world. I'm delighted today to be joined with outstanding speakers, including next keynote speakers, Dr. Adam Bolokos from UNDP and Luis Melo from OECD. Before we wrap up our event today, we will be taking questions and comments from our attendees, and we will end with announcing the next steps for the T20, including next events, which also can be found in our website and in our T20 Twitter account. To conclude, I would like to say once again that the T20 and its partners are devoting their times and efforts to help the world in facing this pandemic. And that event like this bring us together and encourage us to share our expertise. We look forward to working further with our partners across the G20 nations and the world to expedite the transition to recovery. So thank you very much for attending, and back to you, Johara.
Thank you, Dr. Fahad, for the introduction. We will now move to our first keynote speaker, Dr. Adam Bolokos, the resident representative of Saudi Arabia at the United Nations Development Program. Adam, the floor is yours.
Very good. Thank you, Madam Chairperson, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. I'm not sure what the new protocols are in this virtual world, but I offer my sincere thanks to Dr. Al-Turki for the invitation to participate in this event and to represent the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. So after some 25 years in the UN system and in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sudan, Ethiopia, Palestine, Uganda, I truly thought that I had seen it all, but COVID-19 has, I think, shaken all of us to the bone, and the world has literally stopped on so many fronts. A couple of years ago, I was working in the Horn of Africa, and I recall conversations with farmers and pastoralists saying, well, normally we have rain now, and normally the soil would be fertile, and normally the herds of camels would be healthy. But that notion of normal really hadn't existed in the Horn of Africa for a couple of years due to successive droughts and subsequent flooding. But I think, it's a human nature to kind of hang on to the past and to seemingly better days. And globally, collectively, I kind of feel like we're in that same position, that same situation. There's no normal to go back to. We cannot really return to business as usual after COVID. With the plight of millions of destitute, refugees, displaced persons, homeless, hungry, those caught in war, all of those dilemmas have marched on without pause, and their situations have gotten, in some cases, considerably worse. So this is a moment for change, and while immensely stressful and complex, opportunities are emerging, and it's no surprise that the community of think tanks brought together today under the leadership of CAPSARC and the T20 will be instrumental in that change. I have an academic and research background, so I'm also a keen reader of all the work coming out of the T20. So, I feel like I'm among friends today. But where will all this research fit, and how can think tanks contribute as we move from crisis to stabilization? Let me just back up a bit and describe where the United Nations sits in all of this. I'm quite proud to inform you that the United Nations family has come together to present a plan of action called Shared Responsibility, Global Solidarity, responding to the socio-economic impacts of COVID-19. In it, the UN Secretary General calls for a large-scale, coordinated, comprehensive, multilateral response that amounts to at least 10% of the global GDP. All in all, this unprecedented crisis hits weaker countries more severely, and the IMF is estimating some $2.5 trillion are needed globally to tackle the challenge. The programs that the UN has established are in what are called 5 work streams. The first is ensuring that essential health services are available. Second, helping people cope with adversity through social protection and basic services. 3, protecting jobs and supporting small and medium enterprises and informal sectors working throughout the economic recovery. 4th, guiding the necessary surge in fiscal and financial stimulus to make macroeconomic policies work for the most vulnerable and strengthening multilateral and regional response. And finally, 5th, promoting social cohesion and investing in community-led resilience and response systems. These 5 work streams of the UN are inextricably linked to the work of the G20. Through its Vision 2030, Saudi Arabia had already made plans for massive domestic transformation, and now that agenda is carrying over into its role globally. With the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the presidency of the G20, it's their time to shine. However, it has to face the so-called double whammy of low oil prices and the coronavirus. So there are these domestic challenges and in its leadership role in the G20. But Saudi Arabia has an opportunity to show leadership in these turbulent times, just as you, the research community, will have to lead to offer science-based factual guidance to the international community. And I think it's being welcomed in general globally. Investments must complement the UN's health and humanitarian response. They must be investments in resilience and the recognition embodied in the Sustainable Development Goals, that all life on the planet is interconnected and that no single individual should be left behind. UNDP, my agency, will focus on 3 immediate priorities: health system support in close partnership with the World Health Organization, inclusive and integrated crisis management in close cooperation and partnership with the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, and social and economic impact needs assessments and response, the area in which UNDP has been given the technical lead in the United Nations family. The magnitude of COVID will require UNDP to lean on a corporate initiative launched last year to help drive innovation and multidisciplinary efforts. A collection of 60 accelerator labs and 78 UNDP country offices were established. 5 of them are in G20 countries: Argentina, India, Mexico, South Africa, and Turkey. The UNDP accelerator labs are the fastest learning global network on development challenges, and we're now recruiting for a second cohort of 30 laboratories to be based in UNDP country offices around the world, including in Saudi Arabia. We use the power of the crowd, machine learning, and distributed decision-making to support partners to understand problems and develop new solutions, promote more inclusive decision-making, and provide better oversight of what is done. UNDP is identifying grassroots solutions and stretching their potential to accelerate development, bringing activities to scale. We apply experimentation closely with government partners to grow this as a mode of operating to reduce costs of large-scale public sector reforms. Experimentation helps us learn whether particular assumptions are accurate before deploying activities to scale. With a 3-pronged approach of exploration, solutions mapping, and experimentation, the accelerator labs represent UNDP's global disaggregated think tank, and that's a natural counterpart to all of you who are listening to this webinar today. Let me offer now some suggestions on areas where I feel you, the research community, can contribute to the COVID response, whether through the channel of the T20 and the G20 or more broadly. The areas of intervention requiring scientific rigor and engagement are enormous, so let me highlight areas that have a multiplicative impact and ones very closely linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. And these are in no particular order, but they should, please look at them through the sort of lens of job creation as a kind of guiding beacon. First, environmental sustainability. We've been pillaging our magnificent planet at a speed that is devastating, and think tanks must promote nature-based solutions for development. Second, make clear the linkages between nature and health. For example, carbon storage benefits, water supply, purification, soil quality, eco-friendly recreation. Third, gender equality. Women are disproportionately impacted by COVID and are already disadvantaged globally. They are overrepresented in the health sector, are a majority in the informal sector, and are more often victims of violence and exploitation. Moreover, they are often excluded in the design and implementation of research as well as in product development. Fourth, innovations in education. This would include the means of education, training of teachers, production of accessible learning materials, distance learning in remote impoverished locations. Fifth, and the hosts of today's event will recognize the importance of this item, closing the energy gap and diversifying energy usage and modeling. Sixth, food security. With transport linkages disrupted, in many cases broken, how do we fight hunger? How do we encourage and provide good science behind local production and local consumption? Seventh, e-commerce and digital solutions. COVID has demonstrated that internet connectivity and the ability of businesses to shift to electronic means for transactions has been crucial to their survival. Finally, eighth, and my colleague from OECD may speak to this, is the need for research and innovation on the shift from funding to financing. In fact, long before COVID landed in our laps, the Crown Prince himself said the biggest single challenge to achieving the 2030 development agenda and its goal of leaving no one behind was financing. The Saudi presidency of the G20 is taking that to heart by prioritizing a multi-year framework on financing sustainable development, so the most vulnerable do not endure development setbacks and gains made on the SDGs. A stronger focus on financing sustainable development linked to the COVID response, including the provision of universal health coverage, gives an opportunity to the Saudi presidency to establish a truly meaningful legacy at the Riyadh summit. In closing, my dear colleagues, let me wish you all well and encourage you to be bold, to be vocal, but also to be humble. If the coronavirus has taught us anything, it is that we are closer to one another than we ever before imagined, socially, politically, economically. So while the title of this session tells us that times are turbulent, necessity is, after all, the mother of invention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adam, for highlighting the issue from a UNDP perspective. We will now move to our second keynote speaker, Dr. Luis de Mello. Dr. Luis is the Director of Policy Studies at the Economics Department of the OECD. Dr. Luis, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Al-Qaid. Let me take the opportunity to also greet Dr. Al-Turki, Adam, all the panelists, colleagues. It's a great pleasure and an honor to participate in this webinar. Many thanks for the invitation on behalf of the OECD. I think I can only echo the words of Dr. Al-Turki, the video that we've just watched, and Adam in highlighting the extraordinary times we are going through. COVID-19 is causing large-scale loss of life. It's overburdening health systems worldwide. And it's also posing a threat to the global economy of a magnitude that we haven't seen in recent times. And all this comes over and above the challenges we were facing even before the pandemic. Challenges related to climate change, to population aging, meeting the SDGs, and so many more. So this comes over and above the difficulties that we've been grappling with for a long time. The good news is that governments are taking action in several areas, and we at the OECD, we've been developing a policy tracker to collect and share detailed information on national policy responses in all the relevant areas that have been highlighted already. We're working with the G20 and other global fora to leverage this work, which we would like to also share with the G20, the T20, and help you all in this endeavor that opens up for us related to this pandemic. But let me allow in the minutes that I have to make two main points related to our work and how we are supporting countries in this difficult period. One is obviously the action related to minimizing the loss of life related to the pandemic. This is vital in the short term, but it's also related to strengthening the resilience of healthcare systems in preparation for future pandemics of the type that we are seeing today. When it comes to the immediate policy responses, it's particularly important to massively ramp up the production of medical equipment and supplies so that affordable vaccines and treatments can be made available worldwide. For that, strong international coordination and cooperation is needed among several different actors in this space. Vaccine developers, regulators, policymakers, funders, public health bodies and governments, they all needed to come together to work so that safe and effective vaccines can be manufactured in sufficient quantities and made globally accessible. It's also important to bear in mind that vaccines and medicines go where they are needed. Let me just mention a number to you. According to data that we collected before the pandemic, in OECD countries on average, nearly 30% of people in the lowest income quintile forego care because of affordability. This number is 3 times higher than the situation for those in the top income quintile across the countries we've looked at. It's crucial to rebuild our healthcare systems preparedness. Pandemics remind us all too well that healthcare is a global good, so it needs to be tackled as such. And we are happy to share insights from this line of work with the G20 Health Track so that it can inform discussions moving forward. The second point I wanted to make is that action is also needed to keep the global economy afloat. Our latest estimates, so just to give you another number, show that a full lockdown directly affects sectors accounting for about 1/4 to 1/3 of GDP in the major economies around the world. We evaluated that for each month of confinement, the loss of annual GDP growth could be around 2 percentage points. Output losses of this magnitude are not only enormous, but they also put huge pressure on firms. And our analysis shows that without policy intervention, about 20% of the firms that we've looked at across the major economies, 20% could run out of liquidity after 1 month, or about 40% of those firms could run out of liquidity after 3 months. Running out of liquidity in the sense of not having income that is enough to cover their operating costs and their tax and debt repayment obligations. So there is a huge scope and urgency of this situation that calls for decisive collective action by the G20 members in 4 main areas. And if you allow me, I'll speak briefly about those 4. One that is crucially important is to help people and workers through targeted income support. This crisis is particularly affecting the most vulnerable and further stretching social protection systems. Unemployment and underemployment alone as key indicators in this area are rising very fast. To give you 2 examples, in France, more than 1/2 of workers in the private sector have been moved to the chômage partiel, which is a short-term work scheme available in France. In Germany, the same type of scheme, the Kurzarbeit, claims to that scheme have increased 20 times more in recent weeks than in the largest increase that was observed during the great financial crisis. Let's not even talk about the emerging market economies where the impact can be much larger, considering the high levels of informality in the labor force and other deficiencies in healthcare and social protection systems. The hardest hit are obviously those that are already disadvantaged: low-skilled workers, those with non-standard or informal jobs, as well as women and youth. Women are disproportionately represented in the healthcare workforce and face additional family responsibilities at home at the same time. Governments are taking steps to compensate people and firms for the lost earnings, and those initiatives involve, by and large, the postponement of taxes and debt repayments. In some cases, governments are also taking measures to mediate and delay payment of living expenses and utilities for those suffering income losses or liquidity issues. Another point within this broader category of getting the economy going is support for firms, especially those that are suffering from the dramatic decrease in businesses as the unfolding liquidity crisis begins to test their own solvency. As I mentioned before, the COVID-19 pandemic and containment measures are putting corporate balance sheets under tremendous pressure. A word on SMEs, because they are at the center of this economic crisis in many countries. A widespread collapse of SMEs, which represent between 60 and 70% of employment in our economies, could have a very strong impact on the recovery phase and the health of our national economies. In some countries, interventions related to COVID-19 have also involved focusing on insolvency and liquidity in selected sectors that are hardest hit by this, such as transport and tourism. A third point on getting macroeconomics right. Here, the task is obviously to make sure that monetary conditions remain supportive, that markets remain open and liquid, that fiscal policy delivers the counter-cyclical support that is needed to mitigate, at least in part, the effects of the crisis on activity. Big number again. If you look at the situation about 3 weeks ago, G20 countries had pledged $5.4 trillion in fiscal support. That represents about 8% of G20 GDP at the end of 2019. We've recently produced a report precisely on this issue, which we delivered to the G20 Finance and Central Bank Governors meeting on the 15th of April. Another example, if you look only at tax measures, there has been a lot that has been introduced to support businesses and households. On the business side, for instance, the introduction of tax deferrals, flexible tax debt payments, tax filing extensions, enhanced tax refunds are among initiatives that countries are taking. With respect to households, income support has been expanded, tax filing deadlines have been extended, and in many cases, tax payments have been deferred as well. But beyond this immediate recovery, immediate crisis management phase that we are going through now, during recovery, it will be crucial for fiscal stimulus packages to keep providing immediate incentives for households and firms to spend and invest. They need to be credible and well communicated, also to help restore confidence in the ability of governments to steer economies away from the crisis during the recovery phase. Let me make quickly a final point on issues related to trade and global value chains. The international trading system was already under stress before the crisis. A central priority, therefore, must be to refrain from imposing new trade barriers, to properly calibrate containment measures, and to de-escalate trade tensions. It's important to keep global value chains moving, especially for essentials. For example, instead of erecting more trade barriers, we can speed up border checks for medical products and food. We can digitalize and expand and expedite formalities to make sure that global value chains remain in operation. We also need to avoid making things worse. Here, once again, we are starting to see export restrictions on agri-food products, for example, which are very counterproductive for food security. With regards to medical supplies, while some countries are lowering tariffs on them or committing to keep supply chains open, export restrictions on medical supplies have been introduced in over 40 countries based on our monitoring exercise. Going forward, we also we are standing ready to leverage our work on trading value added, the data set that we have, the analysis we've been making in that area to help governments better prepare for future risks and identify supply chain vulnerabilities well in advance of crisis hitting. Let me just conclude by saying that the task before us is enormous. I think we all agree on that. We also agree that international cooperation is crucial at this time of crisis management, but will also be needed during the recovery to make sure that we can put the global economy on a much stronger footing and to prepare it to become more resilient to future crises like the one we are going through now. We at the OECD, we are contributing to these efforts through our analysis, our policy advice to countries and partners, through our contributions to the G20, and we will be delighted to continue to work with the T20, as well as all of you around the table today in these very challenging times, so that we can make the most of international cooperation and collaboration in this area and make sure that our society comes out of this crisis in a much better shape than it entered. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Luis, for the interesting insights, especially on the economic implications of such crisis from an OECD perspective. Before I move it to the panel, I would just like to remind everyone, if you have any question, please write it in the Q&A box. The panelists can answer you privately, or we can go through it at the end of the event. I will now pass it to my colleague, Sarah Kasten, who will be moderating the panel discussion.
So greetings. Thanks very much to Al-Jahara for the introduction. I think we need to go to the next slide there. So it's really an honor to be with everyone today to introduce the details of the substance of the task force. Being an organizer of the COVID-19 task force, I kind of was hearkening back to my childhood, back in the dark ages before we had so much social media and so many options on TV. we had this thing of doing puzzles, and my mom would have the puzzles set up, and inevitably she'd get almost all the way done with a puzzle and realize that one of the kids had knocked over a couple of the pieces. So putting together a task force cohesive narrative really is like putting together a puzzle. You'll see some overlapping issues, but you'll also see some important gaps. So our goal on the T20 COVID-19 task force is to put a cohesive storyline together and fill in some of the subject matter gaps that both UNDP and OECD covered today. So next slide. So we've already covered these task force priorities, so I won't go into great detail here. And I'll move to the next slide. Our first topic will be the role of multilateralism in a post-pandemic world. I'd like to highlight that we have a broad definition of this topic, not just from an economic perspective, but also to include health and pandemic prevention. Today, we'll have Professor Bradlow from the University of Pretoria to give us some of his insights on the topic. Next slide. So we're also delighted to have Dr. Srivastava on the line today. She'll be covering some of the education topic. This topic alone has gotten a great deal of interest, and I'm sure it's not just because a lot of us are doing homeschooling with our children. We see this as the opportunity to move from the business as usual approach to some of the education deficiencies in the world to really hit a reset button. So we're going to be looking forward to the presentation a little bit later in this discussion. Next slide. So the popular press has really seized on to the aspects of the environmental benefits that we've seen in the last months or so. But we need a little bit more than the light analysis from the press and a much more deeper dive into the analysis of the issues. So we're pleased to have this task force to provide this scientific decision analysis. And we'll be featuring a discussion from Dr. Michael a little bit later in the presentation. So health response, preparedness, and impact. This is a huge topic in and of itself. We will not be doing the deep dive on this conversation today, but we are preparing a standalone webinar that will be, doing a similar marketplace of ideas and authors of policy papers under this topic. Social change is similar to the topic of health. We do not have the time today. We do realize that, the virus does not discriminate between rich and poor, but the impacts are very different. So we'll be covering this topic at a later webinar. And finally, we have two speakers today on this topic. We have Dr. Yoshino, and he will be looking at the opportunities and challenges of the finance and infrastructure lens, while Dr. Sarak will be discussing some of the effects of the pandemic on the structure and operations of global production networks. And similar to the health response, we will be covering the pandemic food networks at a later time. So without further ado, I'd really like to jump in to do an introduction of our panelists. I'm going to do this rather rapidly so that we can stay on track with the time out of respect to everyone's busy schedules. It's really an honor to introduce Professor Daniel Bradlow. I've known of his work for the last 20 or more years when he was the dean of the law school where I graduated at the Washington College of Law. He will be speaking on the issue of multilateralism today, and he takes the approach of both a human rights humanitarian perspective, but also the markets and financial institutions. So a great balance of those interests. The next slide. Dr. Yoshino will be joining us today. We are really lucky to have him on the line. He brings the leadership as the previous role of the chair of the T20 Japan, and his recent works include topics such as financial development, economic integration, and infrastructure investments. Dr. Srivastava is here today, and she is going to be one of the valued members of the team. She's focused her work on the concepts of low-fee private schooling, and what was one of the first researchers on this topic in the world. So she'll be giving us some of the insights on how we move from the challenges of education in the future. And Dr. Michaeloa will be presenting his work too. He's previously focused on international climate policy to include clean development mechanisms and other market mechanisms in mitigation and adaptation. And finally, no, we have two more speakers. Dr. Sarek, we welcome him too, and he has an extensive experience with the United Nations Industrial Organization, and he is focused on the role of foreign direct investments and also global value chains and production networks. And closing out the discussion will be something of a mentor of the whole think tank community, Dr. Jim McGann. He will be giving some of the final thoughts on the role, the incredible role that the think tank community can play during these turbulent times, and kind of give us something of the view of how we can get from this stage of the crisis and be a catalyst in the reconstruction. So with no further ado, we'd like to jump into the discussion with Professor Bradlow.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We hear you good. Thank you.
Okay, good. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to CAPSOC and the T20 for inviting me to participate in this panel. It's a great honor. I have joined this process at the last minute in a way, and so as I understand, my assignment today is to talk for about 5 to 7 minutes on the role of multilateralism to stimulate creative discussion and ideas on how to use multilateralism more effectively in dealing with this COVID-19 crisis. To do that, I thought I would make 4 points. The first point, which I hope is not too controversial, is that the institutions and mechanisms of global governance before this crisis were not functioning well, and that it's been demonstrated that multilateralism has not been able to respond as effectively as it should to the crisis. Secondly, that if a multilateral approach to the crisis and its impact is to be effective, we're going to need, firstly, a good global health coordinator. Secondly, we're going to need financial support for vulnerable states and communities from international financial institutions. And finally, as part of that, we're going to need some form of international organizational reform. If we can go to the next slide. On my first point, on damaged global governance, I think I don't need to say too much about this, but I do want to highlight a couple of things. First one is that one of the striking things about the crisis has been how absent the UN has been from the leadership in this crisis. The Security Council has not really spoken effectively. The UN has not really played a leadership role. Secondly, we've seen that the WHO, which in many ways has done a heroic job, but has been handicapped in the way it's responding to the crisis. Part of this, as we know, is because of geopolitics. But secondly, it's because of the resource constraints that the WHO faces. Much of its funding is tied and restricted in various ways. It has very limited resources that are freely available. It has a structure with its regional organizations complicates things and makes it hard to perform its role as easily as it should. And it also faces competition, in a sense, from other international organizations in dealing with health around the world. The G20 has, unlike in the global financial crisis, has not shown the same commitment to common purpose, the same sense of solidarity, which has made it much harder for multilateralism to work well. But we could go into a lot of discussion about this, obviously, But I think our objective today is to think about how do we give advice to the G20 summit this year in Riyadh on what can be done to improve multilateralism. And so my focus is going to be on what can be done within a relatively short period of time, rather than to go into details about how to do deep institutional reform. If we can go to the next slide. So when I say we need a global health coordinator, we need an organization that can coordinate global responses in terms of allocating and marshalling supplies, health supplies, so the masks, the PPEs, the medicines that we need to deal with this crisis, and make sure that they spread relatively equitably and effectively around the global community. Secondly, they can coordinate the efforts to develop a vaccine to make sure that it's developed in the most effective way, and also is distributed well. And thirdly, that makes sure that national health responses are mutually reinforcing, and that countries are not working at cross purposes to each other, but have the information that they need and the ability to cooperate. It seems to me that the organization that needs to play this role is the WHO, ideally in coordination with the G20. But for it to do that, some reforms in a sense are needed. Firstly, I think that the international community, and particularly the G20, seeing it contains the major countries in the world and the richest countries in the world, the WHO needs to be given resources that are not tied to particular projects, that can be used freely, and that cannot be withdrawn, as the US has done recently, so that it can speak openly, honestly, and freely to the world community about what's happening with the crisis, what's working, what's not working, and what needs to be done. Secondly, for that to happen, states need to commit to provide the necessary information to the WHO so that it understands exactly what's happening around the world, and can respond as effectively and honestly and as it needs to. And finally, for the WHO to play this role, it needs to be transparent, a lot more transparent than it's been up till now, and it needs to be more accountable. Not only accountable to the states that are its members and that are its governments are depending on it for information and support, but also accountable to the communities that are its ultimate beneficiaries, and who suffer the consequences if the WHO doesn't play the role that it's supposed to. If we can go to the next slide then, to talk about the international financial support. As one of the previous speakers mentioned, the IMF has said that the international community has a shortfall of about $2.5 trillion in what's needed to deal effectively with the COVID crisis and the economic and financial crisis that follows from that. And I think what needs to be done, in a sense, in the short run is two things. One is we need to squeeze as many new funds as possible from existing sources. Now, the IFIs have responded reasonably effectively. The IMF has created or has used its rapid financing mechanisms, it increased the amount of funding available for that, and it is giving financing to an increasing number of countries. Over, I think, close to 100 countries now have asked for IMF support, and they're getting it with relatively low conditionality. The IMF has also got a facility that some governments are supporting to give debt relief, in the sense that the countries, or this facility helps the countries pay their obligations to the IMF, rather than having them to use their own resources for that. So I think it deserves credit for that, but it needs to expand that. And most importantly, it needs to think carefully about the conditionality attached to its financing to make sure that it can be used, it's used generously, and it's used in a way that's most supportive of the vulnerable communities and the small and medium-sized businesses that are going to need its support. The multilateral development banks have also increased their lending, but I think they need to do much more. And one suggestion, which I think has even been made in the T20 in the past, is that they should be thinking about how important is it to maintain their AAA credit rating. There's been work done showing that if they were willing to accept somewhat lower rating, not significantly lower, but maybe one rung lower, they could expand their lending capacity significantly. And I think that's something to consider. Third, the rich countries in the world also need to squeeze new funding for developing and emerging markets. And one of the ways to do that is many of them are sitting with SDR allocations from the global financial crisis that they haven't used, that they could donate in various different ways to emerging markets, but to be used to support them. Finally, as we know, one of the developments over the last 10, 20 years has been the growing importance of private sources of funding to emerging markets and developing countries, and that there's going to be a need for some form of debt relief, initially in the form of a debt standstill, but that's not as simple as it seems, because it's not just the question of suspending payments due on those debts, the interest and principal payments, but it's also making sure that those debts do not fall into the hands of vulture funds that would use them now or in the future to extract large payments from the debtor country. One of the big shifts in private sector activity in the last few years has been a shift from a focus just on shareholder values to thinking more about stakeholder approaches and environment, social, and governance issues. And I think this needs to be advanced significantly. And particularly, there have been a number of international standards that have been developed for how business should function. Most prominently is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, but there are many others as well, including on how to renegotiate debt. And I think the private sector needs to think carefully, and the T20 can push them to think more about how to use those funds. There are also new sources. Unfortunately, at the moment, the opportunities for a new SDR allocation, and many people have called for that, look as to be politically infeasible in the short run. But I think if the international community keeps calling for that, something can be done on that over time, and hopefully the G20 will keep pushing for that. The other source of potential funds that can be tapped is the IMF has substantial gold holdings, which it carries on its books at about $4.5 billion US dollars. But the gold price, that's the historical value of those goods. The value today is about $130 billion. And so there's a significant amount of money that the IMF could raise through those gold sales that could be used for a number of different purposes now. Last point, if we can look at the next slide, is it's true that the time for serious reform of international organizations is not now. We're in the middle of a crisis and we need to deal with the crisis. But I think we can't ignore the fact that over the last decade, the reputational damage that has been done to the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, in a number of different ways because of scandals in all of them are important. And that all of them have the capacity to make some reforms that would restore some of their credibility and legitimacy without requiring difficult international negotiations. And the most important of those are to improve their transparency so people understand better what's going on with those institutions and how they make their decisions and policies. And most importantly is to improve their accountability. The World Bank and the multilateral development banks have done this for over 20 years now, but the other international organizations need mechanisms that allow governments and most importantly affected communities to be able to hold them accountable when they don't live up to the standards that they should. Thank you. I'll stop at that point.
Great. So thank you so very much. And thanks again for putting together everything on such short notice. These are important conversations to talk about, especially about structuring at what phase we can do what and how quickly we can influence the framing of the issues on multilateralism. So with that said, I think that we will now be moving to Dr. Yoshino, and I believe his slides are up.
Thank you very much for inviting me. My task force is infrastructure and infrastructure finance. So I'd like to talk about 3 points. Please go to next slide. I'd like to talk about 3 points today. Please go to next slide. Okay. First one is fiscal stimulus is increasing in many countries. And also the recession of many countries will reduce tax revenues. So I'm afraid fiscal deficits are increasing in many countries. That means infrastructure finance supported by the government will drastically reduce in future. So we need to bring private sector finance into infrastructure investment. Secondly, lots of foreign investors are now flying back to their home country. So in other words, infrastructure finance is lacking of capital from abroad. So in order to mitigate those disparities, first we need to bring private sector finance by increasing the rate of return from infrastructure investment. And also in order to increase the rate of return, regional development is very important. Small businesses, companies, and agricultural farmers, they can sell their products and also they can invest into much more in varieties. So I think the quality of infrastructure, we define it as the spillover effects of infrastructure investments are very important. And big infrastructure will create gender equality, female participation in the labor market, and education together with infrastructure will create bigger spillover effects. Especially when we looked at the 40 United Nations data, secondary school and university education together with infrastructure created large spillover effects into the region. So I think those are additional measures will be important in adding to infrastructure investment in order to boost the economy. Please go to next slide. Please go to next slide. Okay. Traditionally, infrastructure has very low rate of return compared to government bond. And private sectors are reluctant to invest into infrastructure because infrastructure relied on user charges. Water supply, price has to be low. Electricity, prices has to be low. Then rate of return from infrastructure investment must be low. That means private sectors are reluctant to invest into infrastructure. However, this red line shows some infrastructure that create big spillover effects into the region. Property tax will rise, and SMEs start their business, and corporations will sell their products much more. Corporate tax, income tax, sales tax, property tax, all of them go up. Please go to next. However, in the past, return from infrastructure came from this green line, user charges. However, spillover effects has created huge tax revenues into the government, and it was not returned to infrastructure investors. That is why private sectors could not invest much more into infrastructure. So I'm proposing 50% of those increased red portion of tax revenue should be returned to infrastructure investors. Then blue dotted line will become the revenue for infrastructure investment. So that means lots of private sectors are willing to invest into infrastructure. And even the foreign investors are coming into many countries for the development of infrastructure, which can boost the economy, reduce the income disparities, labor participation, female participation into the labor market. Please go to next. And one of the difficulties in many Asian regions, land ownership is one of the headaches. Many people do not want to sell their land. Even if railway has been completed, station has a very nice building, but the surrounding region is not developed. Regional development will play a very important role in infrastructure. So land trust is one of the ways to smoothen the usage right of land. Landowners can own the land for 99 years or 999 years and lease the land to infrastructure company. So they are the landowner, but usage right goes to infrastructure investors. And that will reduce the cost of purchasing land and also the negotiation time will be minimized. Please go to next. Last part is the SME related to infrastructure investment. As I mentioned, infrastructure is very important to create new jobs and new businesses into the region. It is not only large companies, but also small businesses can start their own restaurant, their own shop, so that they can sell their products. However, banks are reluctant to lend money to those small businesses. So there are 4 ways to cope with that. One is hometown crowdfunding. This is one of the methods developed in Peru, Vietnam, Mongolia, Japan, and Cambodia. And people in the region or people in the country will contribute small amount of money to those startup businesses and small businesses. Some cases, 250 people contributed small amount of money. Last slide, please. And this will create the new businesses for the ladies in case of Vietnam. On the right-hand side is 40 Vietnamese ladies who started their own small shops along the station. Left-hand side is one Cambodian lady who started her own business along the road. All of these money came from crowdfunding contributed by small amount of money of the community. So banks are reluctant to lend money, but the community can support these ladies. So this will encourage ladies' business into the region. That will create a big spillover effects. And another method for small businesses is quick loans after the COVID-19. Private small businesses have been suffering. So I think zero interest rate and quick loan will be needed. And third one is credit guarantee. Private banks are reluctant to lend money to these small businesses who are facing with downturn of the economic activities. So Credit Guarantee Corporation should give higher guarantee ratio so that they can they can keep on doing their business. Last one is some of the small business are difficult to sell their products. And internet sales are growing in Asian region. So internet companies can introduce their products through internet and they can sell those products by using new infrastructure investment. So I think COVID-19 has influenced first, big budget deficits. So infrastructure financing, we need private sector money. Second one is overseas investors flew away back to their home country. In order to bring them back to infrastructure, rate of return has to be increased and risks has been reduced. And last one is small businesses. Development of small businesses are very important. And then gender participation into small businesses are important. So financing to them are critical in order to develop the region. Those are my points. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that contribution. The approach that I like the most in this webinar so far is that we're able to get some top-down guidance from OECD on those international financial institutions and those mechanisms, but then we're also able to hear from Dr. Yoshino on small and medium enterprises and some of those unintended consequences of migration. So thank you for that contribution. Next, we'll be moving on to Dr. Prashi Srivastava, and she'll be speaking on the topic of education. And in advance, a lot of the discussion on the chat and also the question and answer are dealing with the interwoven issues on education. We probably won't be able to get to all of those topics today, but it really does reinforce the importance of the issue from a global perspective. So with no further ado, I'll go ahead and mute and let Dr. Prashi take.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me on this panel. I want to start off by saying that what I'll be talking about today is very much the policy brief submission. And I'm aware that many of you will have many questions about the global education emergency caused by COVID-19, given the gravity of the situation that we're in. Feel free to ask those questions, and I will try and answer them even after the session if I don't get to it in this particular presentation. The proposal and the policy brief has been led by Dr. Alejandra Gardini, who is with CPEC Argentina. And we are a group of authors from a number of institutions, including UNICEF, IIEP, UNESCO, and the International Network for Education in Emergencies. And so this is truly a collaborative effort. But I'm going to start off by just laying out the context a little bit in terms of where we're at. I think all of us are aware of the large-scale mass disruption that we are facing in education at every sector in every country. It is the largest mass disruption of education in history, and it peaked in about 7 weeks. So China was the first country to announce localized school closures in the middle of February, and in about 7 weeks, the map that you see here has been put together by UNESCO. UNESCO has been charting and monitoring school closures right from the beginning. So at the peak, we had roughly 1.7 billion children out of school. That number is still roughly the same, but right today we have around 177 nationwide school closures, but at the peak it was 193 countrywide school closures. This affects almost every child and every youth in the entire world. It affects an entire generation. I mean, I think when we put it in those terms, and we think about the impact all the way from early childhood through to learners at every level, we recognize how severe and how quick this education emergency is. And the policy response to school closures, or of school closures, was a near universal policy response in an effort to curb transmission in the very early stages, when at that time we still did not have clear indications of evidence, and we still are actually grappling with the evidence on transmission. We're grappling with how effective school closures are in this context. And these are questions that, are I think, integral to adopting a multi-sectoral approach, and particularly one that's much more coordinated between health and education than we have seen in most countries, and even in the global level. So what are the known risks of school closures? We have a big cadre of evidence on these risks, both in terms of previous health crises like the Ebola crisis, like the influenza pandemic in Europe. And we also have a big cadre of evidence more generally in terms of disruptions in emergencies, disruptions as a result of conflict, and general lack of access. So the known risks are learning loss and dropout, physical and sexual abuse and violence. We saw an increase in underage pregnancies during the Ebola crisis. We know that not having regular access to schooling increases mental health and psychosocial impacts. It reduces emotional support and the opportunity for healthy relationships between peers. But the other thing that we have, I think, very quickly, which has very quickly come to the fore, and which is often overlooked, is that schools are not just a place for learning. They are also hubs for the provision of essential services. For example, nutrition and food, allied health services, psychosocial and developmental services. And those services are usually taken advantage of or availed by the most disadvantaged or most vulnerable. And when schools are closed without having a multi-sectoral approach, those effects are compounded. The effects of school closures are compounded on the most vulnerable in societies, and within particular contexts, who those exact groups will change. But generally, we can say that these will be compounded on children and students coming from lower income backgrounds, children and students with special needs, generally excluded communities. These might be ethnic communities, religious communities, urban or rural communities, slum communities, depending on which context we're talking about. And particularly girls, which are even more disadvantaged in low income and lower middle income countries. Finally, children in vulnerable circumstances, children who have been orphaned, and we know that in certain African countries, the impact of HIV/AIDS has left a generation of children who have been orphaned. And so that tends to affect them more. And it is compounded in children who are already affected by crisis and conflict. And I want to add that before we entered the pandemic, we already had 250 million children, 50% of whom were in conflict and crisis affective contexts who are out of school. So this is just compounding those inequities. Next slide, please. Okay, I think there's been a bit of a change in what we can see. If you can just go back to the previous slide, I'll talk to some of the points that are not as visible on this slide. This slide talks about the policy changes, the policy challenges that actually affect the situation for response at primarily globally, but also in terms of a G20 response. And here, what I would like to say is that we enter the pandemic globally in terms of inequities at two levels. At institutional level inequities within systems and individual level inequities that affect individuals that are operating within systems. Those institutional level inequities are very much related to resource supply and allocation and education financing. Very quickly, we know that domestically, many countries have already been underfinancing education. 1 in 4 countries do not meet the international targets for education finance. And as well, the donor community has underfinanced education. And this has led to large resource gaps in resource supply. It has led to gaps in allocation of funding. And within countries, domestically, especially in lower middle income countries and low income countries, we have seen that resources for education from the public purse tend to benefit children coming from households in the top 10% of income brackets. So we are already entering this pandemic with that gap. And when these closures occur, when mass disruption occurs, it is further compounded by that. The other set of inequities that we enter the pandemic in are individual level inequities. This is how are children and learners integrated into systems. We know that there are large learning gaps. Roughly 450 million children and youth who attend schools are not able to master the basic technical and reading and math skills that we would like them to. So that's already an issue in terms of learning gaps. We know that there are access and quality gaps. So what are the compulsions for G20 countries? Well, the first level of compulsions have to do with what every country is facing, which is a domestic response. We all have to respond to our own domestic issues in terms of the disruption that COVID has caused. But in terms of G20, there is a further compulsion in terms of its regional and global influence. Many times within regional contexts, countries will be looking at how is it that particular countries in that region responded, whether it is in terms of mass and remote learning, whether it is in terms of looking at teacher well-being, whether it is in terms of looking at the different sectoral responses or partnerships that those countries have taken to deliver education in this time. And the other compulsions that G20 countries, particularly the G7 countries, who are also OECD donors have, or who are OECD donors within this group, they have a compulsion to respond in terms of how they support other systems for recovery. And that's where some of the questions in terms of multilateral cooperation, in terms of cross-sectoral collaboration, in terms of increasing and perhaps increasing allocations for financing towards education will come in. Next slide, please. So what are some of the policy responses and some of the actions that we propose in our brief, these are all guided by the underlying policy principle that states are the primary bearers for the right to education. And that this principle, this obligation, which is in many cases institutionalized within international human rights law, is heightened in the case of emergencies. That principle must be abided for, and how do we enact that within the context of the emergency we're in? So we propose 5 actions, and I won't have time to go into them in very much detail, but I can list them. And if you have questions, again, please feel free to ask us. The first is to institute and extend integrated and cross-sectoral approaches. As I mentioned, schools and formal education institutions are often hubs for a series of coordinated services. And in many instances, education planning is less cross-sectoral than we would like it to be. And so one thing to think about very seriously is how is for example, education ministry, firstly, is there even a federal education ministry or a national education ministry within countries? In some countries, there are none, because systems are highly decentralized, and there might not be a convening ministry or bureau or a national department for education. That means domestic coordination must be strengthened for a more targeted approach. But in terms of cross-sectoral approaches, what is the coordination with ministries of health, with labor, with child and welfare, with questions around business and enterprise? How are we actually looking at the education response as a coordinated response? The second is to ensure education continuity and access to focus on the most vulnerable. As we've mentioned, the most vulnerable are their situation in this, both in terms of the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic, as well as the health impact of the pandemic, and the education impact, is going to be compounded. So how can we coordinate our mechanisms and our targeted responses to ensure that that their needs are being met? One of the first responses that we saw in many OECD countries in particular, but generally around the world, is this knee-jerk reaction to switching learning online. That was one of the first responses. It's one of the responses that we still see. And what we've seen is, even within OECD countries, switching learning online very quickly and almost overnight has serious gaps in terms of access. Which households have access to technology? Which households have access to those technologies? So what are some of the other ways that we can reach these communities? Are we looking at catch-up education programs? Are we looking at accelerated learning programs? Are we looking at radio and television broadcasting? Many countries have looked at this and instituted different responses, but it's really trying to think of how do we procure and how do we provide services to the most vulnerable using different technologies, using different mechanisms within the particular context that we're trying to serve. The third is to address teachers and their well-being, their capacity and their conditions as education frontline workers. Now, one of the issues within the pandemic is what is considered an essential service and what is not. In many contexts, education, believe it or not, is not an essential service. That means that in that context, though schools were able to be closed, right? But we know that in terms of life chances and life opportunities, education is absolutely an essential service. So how do we address teachers, their capacity, their situations within the current context that we're in? Teachers themselves are part of families, they are part of other institutions, they are also being impacted by this pandemic in the same way that we all are. Some of the teachers, their livelihoods will be more secure than others, in particular in contexts where a large proportion of teachers are teaching in private schools, which depend on fees, which may no longer be viable, and schools are closing in those contexts. How do we secure their situations? How do we secure the education opportunities of those children within those contexts? Fourth, to ensure adequate and additional financing, both domestically and globally. We've entered the pandemic with global financing gaps, and those will need to be met within the context that we're in, but also to enact international cooperation and cross-collaboration. And this is where I think the role of the G20 can have a pretty large, I think a large kind of signaling role in terms of learning from each other, particularly from the countries within the G20 that have had much more experience with disrupted access, with having continued access issues. I think there's a lot to learn within that context. And finally, to institute safe and school operations and open better schools when appropriate. I think we have a real opportunity to reimagine education, learning, and schooling within this context. It shouldn't just be a question of let's just return to schools the way we know them, but also to reimagine education. And in the context of the pandemic that we're in, when countries decide to reopen schools, and UNESCO, UNICEF, World Bank, and WFP together just jointly released a framework for thinking about reopening schools. But when countries decide that it is safe and it is appropriate to do so, that we do so in a way that recognizes the sanitation, the sanitization needs, the health needs, the extra equipment that might be required from a technical, procedural viewpoint, but also in terms of reimagining learning. So I'll end there, and I know you probably have many, many questions, but I think just like all the other themes in this task force, we could spend a whole session, many, many sessions on discussing the education emergency and ways forward.
Thank you so very much. I want to highlight that, you know, we do like the theme of reimagining education, because a lot of the thought leadership is, it's not that we go back to the business as usual, but how do we take this opportunity of the crisis and emerge stronger? And same as the health line of effort or the education line of effort, we're hoping to be doing separate webinars so that we can take a more deep dive into the discussion. So thanks for your time today. We have 3 speakers left, and we'll try to keep on schedule. We have 30 minutes approximately left. We'd like to save at least 10 or 15 minutes for questions. We have some come in. And so if we can move through the next 3 presentations within about a 5-minute discussion each. And so we will now move to Dr. Michaela, which I'm making your name sounds not pronounced well, but you will be next up. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Good. Thank you very much. So I'm really happy to talk to you about the recovery policies that are consistent with transformation towards a climate neutral society. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the challenge that we face is, in an unprecedented way, the governments have pledged trillions for economic recovery. On the right-hand side, you just see the numbers from the European Union, 3.4 trillion euro for recovery activities. Of course, that's a big mix of short-term, medium-term, long-term financing. But as one now goes through the crisis, there are increasing fears that the recovery programs could lead to a lock-in of high carbon technologies. So we've seen, for example, various car producers stating, yeah, and there needs to be a subsidy program for car sales. And that, of course, should not be linked to any technology, but any technology that is currently on the market should benefit. And then, of course, it's clear that the mature technologies will probably have an advantage compared to the emerging low carbon technologies. And historically, there has been the precedent that recovery programs after the economic and financial crisis of 2008 were focusing mostly on mature technologies that had high emission intensities instead of accelerating the transition to low carbon technologies. One important aspect also is that many of these recovery programs now are aiming to be dispersed in a very rapid manner. And of course, in a rapid manner, the incumbent technologies always have an advantage. Whereas the new emerging low carbon technologies will face difficulties in having access to these programs. Next slide, please. So what we want to address in our policy brief is the design of recovery policies that are compatible with the transition towards climate neutrality. So one important aspect we want to look at: how can policies ensure the persistence of behavioral changes that we've seen during the pandemic and that are actually contributing to a low carbon transition? For example, what we are doing here now in our webinar is a low carbon transition, because we don't meet somewhere in the city of Riyadh to discuss, but we are having a good discussion without having travel related emissions. And of course now many actors, entities, companies, and we've heard about the education sector just before, have now generated a lot of experience how to do joint activities without the need to travel. And that, of course, if one is able to have perennialization of this behavior, then of course it could lead to a world economy that has a much lower travel intensity than the economy had before the crisis struck. So one aspect, of course, now will be what kind of policies can we have that is actually supporting such a transformation and a persistence of these behavioral changes. Then secondly, and that's of course the question that relates directly to the previous historical experiences, how can we design specific subsidy or tax rebate programs that are now coming up in a way that they actually will harness the technologies that we need for the low carbon transition? And one important sector, of course, are automobiles. Just as an example, in Germany, there will be a car summit next Tuesday. And of course, everybody is clamoring from the car industry that it should come up with a specific policy recommendation. That's exactly what I meant with this need for speed. And of course, that is now the question: what type of policies can we introduce, and also now rapidly? And that's of course where G20 plays an important role, being a broker of good policy solutions that prevents that due to the need to rush, all these subsidy programs will not be able to focus. A similar issue relates to construction. Many actors have suggested that policies could also engage in the construction sector. And that, of course, would be a very interesting field to go towards energy efficient buildings, especially in emerging economies. A third sector that we should focus on in our policy brief is tourism. Of course, tourism has been hit probably most hardest of any sector. And of course, the question is, in the rebuilding of tourism, can we structure it in a way that it leads to a low emission tourism infrastructure? And also, now going beyond the subsidy programs, but on the direct state spending on infrastructure, the question is whether ideas that had been previously raised but always deferred due to lack of budget, whether such ideas can now be mobilized in the context of direct infrastructure investment in terms of land transport. For example, it's clear that hydrogen vehicles need a lot of infrastructure. Is the crisis here an opportunity for large programs? And then a broader field which relates to the so-called negative emission technologies. These are technologies, for example, to capture CO2 from the air and store it, or to use bioenergy and link it to such capture and storage technologies. And these programs so far have really suffered a lot. So these are the policy issues we want to address in our policy brief. And of course, we want to differentiate into short, medium, and long-term issues that can be driven by G20 action. And of course, I'm happy to take your questions and comments. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We did have one more of an interjection than a question, but it was a reinforcement of the importance of all of the issues that you raised in your presentation, and then an offer to also provide inputs on the circular carbon economy as that brief comes together. So thank you very much, and we'll move to our second to last speaker, Dr. Sarek, will be launching in right now.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Well, first of all, thank you for our partners and colleagues at CAPSARC for extending the kind invitation to UNIDO to join the panel. We are certainly pleased to contribute to the T20 deliberations in the context of the COVID-19 task force. And we're also pleased to know that our submission for developing a more targeted policy brief on the impact of COVID-19 on the operations of global value chains or global production networks has been accepted as well. I understand that maybe not everyone around the table and listening in today is aware of UNIDO or what UNIDO stands for. We are special mandated in countries around the world, and we are certainly focusing more on developing countries of the world. But needless to say, we see a big role in having outlets such as the T20 and the G20, of course, being used to that and as well to inform the policy debate on how inclusive and sustainable industrialization may help fight the current crisis. What I have prepared today, I don't have any slides. I would just like to briefly talk about some of the key points or takeaways that we would like to nest within our policy brief and to stimulate some of the discussion as we move forward towards developing that policy brief. I assume also that not everyone in the audience is aware of the term global value chains or global production networks. So maybe just to bring everyone to the same speed, I would start by a very quick introduction or explanation of what this term stands for, what it is, in fact, and then how it relates to the current crisis. And in fact, it relates hugely if you follow some of my points that I will make. So, in terms of global value chains, in fact, over the past 4 decades, much of the manufacturing production worldwide has been organized within those global value chains. So maybe link to the device you are currently using to listen into this roundtable, which has been really manufactured in the world. So it is not a product of a single country. So what that means, in fact, is that raw materials and semi-finished goods or intermediates are shipped around the globe, oftentimes multiple times, and then they are assembled in yet another location, and that final output is then being re-exported to consumers in both developed and developing countries. So GVCs tend to follow a hub and spoke structure. The hubs are Japan, the United States, European Union, and more recently China, which really form the core of these production networks. They're multinational enterprises or foreign enterprise, M&Es. They span the web of global production networks, which they structure often via direct investments that are motivated either by market-seeking motives, efficiency, or resource-seeking motives. Most of the other parts of the world act then as spokes, but they have nevertheless equally important role in ensuring that many of the products that we use on a daily basis carry the label made in the world indeed. GVC as a concept and GVC participation in particular has been also advocated by both multilateral and bilateral development partners as a tool to ensure development or to promote development. And this has been largely based on successful examples that we've observed in many parts of Asia, East Asia in particular. The assumption being here that successful participation in those global production networks would grow both knowledge, capital, labor in developing countries, and therefore offer a route for growth and development. So I think it is an extremely pertinent issue to tackle in the context as an immediate response. UNIDO has been partially leading the way within the UN system in addressing some of the immediate issues, maybe more on the upstream side of the discussion, on what will be indeed the implications for operations of global production networks, and what this crisis implies actually for the future. So what I would like to do briefly is just outline a few points that we would like to further examine in the context of a policy brief for this task force. The first one being that this is what we would like indeed to highlight, is that COVID-19 has struck at the very core of these GVC hub regions, and that this will have a significant implication for the world economy. So the lockdowns, which have resulted in factory closures initially in China and then rapidly spread to EU, US, and elsewhere, have led to a very sharp contracting of both output within the manufacturing sector, but also international trade flows. And indeed, from some of the work that we have done looking at monthly trade data, we already see that the sharpest falls in trade in industries is happening, including electronics, equipment, automobile, textile, and apparel industries, for instance. So to illustrate that point further, one could look at this connection, for instance, between the production networks between China and Germany, where a drop in imports from China implies that vital production parts for German manufacturing are missing. And indeed, we looked at the data from German Statistical Office as well on input-output relationships, which actually shows that almost a quarter of all intermediate inputs that go into German products are in fact imported, and 10% of them are coming indeed from China, which is a very significant number, obviously. So we see that this trend will have a very strong knock-on effects in both developed, but then will be also trickling down to developing countries very soon. And this has very severe implications for both economic growth and subsequently development of those regions. That's also my second point indeed that I would like to highlight, is that this decline will have a strong impact on countries further up and down the supply chains. And of course, it will be significantly felt in developing countries. So the COVID-19 crisis has a sort of a double negative consequence, if you want, on the operations of GVCs. The first one is that the lockdowns have created supply bottlenecks, which are then further aggravated by a reduction in demand from the customers further up the supply chain. And this is very new, and especially in comparison to the past crisis, be it the financial crisis or SARS in early 2000, or Fukushima, I mean, at least in terms of their relation to global value chains. Because we are experiencing here at the same time both supply and demand shocks. So the cumulative effect of these two shocks may indeed then increase the risk of global manufacturing entering a downward spiral, where possibly causing at the same time significant damages to operations of many of those cross-border supply chains, and at the same time further dampening the prospects for growth and development. And my final point here would be that this shock that we are experiencing at the moment, both to the supply and demand side, is not confined to production and trade only, but is very quickly spilling over to investments as well. We are currently witnessing largest ever recorded capital outflows from emerging markets. There is an unprecedented number of more than 100 countries requesting emergency financing. And colleagues at UNCTAD have recently come up with initial estimates stating that there will be a hugely negative effect on FDI, foreign direct investment flows, over the coming years, with contracting estimated in the range of 30 to 40%. So these are really staggering numbers that carry a lot of negative messages for those who depend on FDI as a means to join global production networks, acquire knowledge, capital, and increase their labor stocks. So coupled with this decreasing international production and trade, we certainly need to address the issue of forthcoming economic troubles that many of the countries in both developed but predominantly developing countries will be facing. And this also urges us to rethink some of our existing policy approaches to managing economic crisis. And here again, I think the T20 in particular is a particularly suitable forum to discuss the implications. I would like to wrap up by just highlighting two issues of discussion that we would like to bring into the policy brief, and they relate to the question of what does the current crisis, COVID-19, imply for the future of global value chains. And I think the first that needs to be addressed is that we are currently seeing, and we are probably to anticipate, stronger national calls for re-examination, if you want, of established economic models, in particular those with respect to international production of goods. And COVID-19 is certainly giving fuel to that. We have seen already calls in the US for some time, but increasingly also from some countries in Europe and elsewhere, where leading government politicians have called for a rethinking of their companies' approaches to international outsourcing of production, oftentimes claiming that this is in order to avoid future supply bottlenecks while increasing resilience of their own supply chains. Now, enacting such policies may have unintended negative effects on both developed but also developing countries, especially those that depend on GDCs for realizing their economic growth and development strategy. Hence, we hope that this policy brief may indeed also be used to contribute to that discussion of intended as well as unintended effects of policy making in relation to COVID-19. And my second point, in direct relation to the future of global value chains, relates to the firms, and in particular multinational enterprises, which will be drawn by this crisis to re-examine their risk assessments with respect to operating their own global production networks. And for many of them, the solution oftentimes is to increase preparedness or resilience to future global restrictions by embracing new production technologies. So we feel very strongly and anticipate indeed here again that there will be an increasing trend towards faster uptake of automation and advanced digital production technologies. If you think about intelligent robots, 3D printing, etc., everything that is summed up usually under the term of fourth industrial revolution or industry 4.0. So they may indeed gain pace following COVID-19 crisis, and could ultimately lead to a shortening of global value chains via increased reshoring or backshoring. We have already collected some insights through firm level surveys as well on these aspects, and we will be certainly interested in bringing in some of these novel insights into the policy briefs as well. Taken together, we hope that our contribution to the task force and the policy briefs will help ultimately develop better policies and responses to the current crisis, And we very much look forward to working and collaborating with the T20 Secretariat and all the partners within. Thank you very much for having us here once again.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Sarek. And we will then now move on to our final speaker, Dr. McGann, and we'll close off with maybe some of his guidance on the role of think tanks as we move from crisis to stabilization. All right, Professor McGann, are you on the line?
Sorry, I had it muted while I was waiting. First and foremost, I want to thank CAPSARC and the King Faisal Center for their extraordinary efforts under extremely difficult circumstances and how they've risen to the occasion and the challenge that we all now face. Their leadership is key. The meeting, the G20 meeting, could not be more critical, given the fact that we have never had a crisis that engulfs the entire globe at the same time with the same impact. This crisis demands that think tanks lead an effort and a rapid response to the challenges we face. So as to support the policymakers, the healthcare professionals and others who are on the front lines of the crisis, and the elderly, poor, and vulnerable who are suffering through it. They need our ideas and action, and we must do everything in our power to respond. The magnitude, the speed, and the viral nature in the broadest sense of the word has transformed the way that we look at policy. We had digital disruptions, we had political disruptions, but this is the king of disruptions that essentially transforms how we must think about policy priorities, how we must organize and structure our institutions, and in order to be more responsive and in order to provide reasonable solutions in a rapid format. And specifically, what I'm talking about is that we must adjust our thinking that there will be no new normal. There will only be abnormal, meaning that the only constant will be change and disruptions. And we need to rethink how we're approaching policy issues. And that means moving from what has historically been the soft spot for think tanks is the mid and long term. This issue and what I've been talking about for some time, the increased velocity of information and policy flows demands a rethink of how we approach the analysis and production of the ideas and response to crises that I think will be a regular disruptive part of our lives. In consultation with CAPSARC and a planning committee of over 80 think tanks around the world, and now over 300 think tank scholars and institutions, along with CAPSARC and King Faisal and others, we have launched 2 global think tank summits. And in keeping with CAPSARC's pledge in terms of inclusiveness, we have involved think tanks in every major country and all the regions of the world in these 2 think tanks. The next one, which I encourage all of you to join, will take place on May 13th. And it will focus on developing evidence-based rapid response to some of the immediate and longer-term challenges posed by COVID-19. The first is addressing the public health crisis. The second working group will look at preparing national and international strategies for economic recovery and revitalization. The third working group will identify innovative and inclusive public and private intervention strategies to help vulnerable groups. The fourth working group will foster international cooperation, creating rapid, responsive, and resilient systems to respond to future crises. And then finally, since it involves think tanks, being fit for an uncertain future, new operating models for think tanks, research, communications, and funding. Each of these 5 groups have 6 or 7 institutions that have agreed to spearhead the effort to develop a rapid response in each one of these areas that will be reported out on the 3rd and final think tank summit. The effort is to essentially mobilize the international think tank community to support national governments, IGOs, the G7 and the G20 in the work that they're doing, and in no way to duplicate the efforts to work in close coordination and to understand the importance and legitimacy of existing institutions and groups like the G20, like the T20 and G20 in Saudi Arabia, to support their efforts and the work that all of you are doing. I encourage you to join with us as we launch this effort in support of what you are doing and to attend the second global think tank virtual town hall, which I've titled From Solidarity to Solutions to Save Lives and Livelihood, which will take place on Wednesday, May 13th from 8:30 to 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time. Thank you all very much. It's very clear that the contributions each one of you have made, and I am riding on the tailwinds of your excellent presentations and look forward to collaborating with you as we have done with CAPSART and the other T20 members.
Thank you so very much, Dr. McGann, and thank you also for highlighting our partner at the King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies and the haste of putting together the whole presentation. Of course, I failed to mention our very most important partner in the whole T20 process. So I will take responsibility for that omission. So thanks for reinforcing that. We are definitely coming up to the end of our hour, and I want to stress that there's a rich discussion going on in the chat and also many questions in the Q&A that we won't be able to address at this venue, but we'll take those offline, consolidate them, and it'll probably be the fact that those will influence the way we frame the discussions with the individual webinars that are coming up. So I'm going to close though with 2 questions. I think some of our speakers have had to drop offline, but if Dr. Bouloukos is still available from UNDP, there is one question on how the think tank community can intersect with the UNDP accelerator labs to do collaborative or synergistic research. If you're still online, would you be able to take that question?
Sure, absolutely, Sarah. So Adam Bouloukos again from UNDP. The accelerator labs exist in some 78 UNDP country offices. Some of the G20 countries are represented there. I think the easiest thing to do would be to provide that information, the linkages to Sarah, that could then be distributed to colleagues who are on this webinar, because the 7 to 8 different countries, and I don't want to list them, and there are many different people who are there. But the idea is that those accelerator labs are embedded in UNDP country offices. They're providing solutions to the UNDP country team, UNDP team, as well as the United Nations country team in those countries. So perhaps after the event, I can share if there's any mass emailing that goes out to the group. I can provide some more information on the locations of the accelerator labs, the content of their work, and where they might need some engagement. All of this is on the UNDP global website, undp.org. So colleagues can poke around there a bit and see where they might have overlapping activities, either thematically or geographically. Over.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. And we're going to close with one final question. And that deal is targeted to Dr. Yoshino. And the question is, the pandemic and economic lockdown will worsen inequality. What kind of policy measures can be taken to reduce coronavirus's regressive distributional effects? Does this link directly with your presentation, or is there any amplifying data that you'd like to provide at this time?
Okay, thank you very much. I think many developing countries require lots of infrastructure development and also urbanization policies. And however, this pandemic has expanded huge budget deficits. So I think it is very important to create spillover effects, big spillover effects, financing private activities and bringing back private capital into the country again by increasing the rate of return coming from spillover effects. And spillover effects of infrastructure investment is the key for the development of the region. Gender equality and income equality can be achieved. So the government policy has to focus not only just constructing infrastructure, but also bringing the capital back again to each countries by raising their rate of return and reducing risks. Those are the role of multilateral institutions and government role. But the pure activity should be rely on private sector finance and private activities, supported by government and international organizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for the amplifying information. And we're going to scrub the question and answer section and also the chat section so that we can make sure that we're addressing these key issues within the policy briefs, and they'll be intertwined into the upcoming webinars. So thank you all for the participation and the excellent support, especially on short notice. And I'm going to now turn this over to my colleague, Al Jahara.
Thank you, Sarah. So due to time limitation, I'm going to go over the timeline very quickly and then we'll close. So this is a view of the key milestones of the Saudi Arabia T20 process so far. We started back in September 2019 with the formulation, the brainstorming of potential priorities. Our colleagues from Japan, Dr. Yoshino, has helped tremendously throughout the process. Then we had a workshop back in October 2019 to prepare and get expert input on the ideas we brainstormed. After that, we called for abstracts in November. We've received a tremendous number of abstracts, were consolidated. And of course, this is all for the previous task forces. We have 10 task forces, and the newly established COVID-19 is some kind of a fast track and ad hoc task force that was launched just last month. By December, we closed the abstracts. By January 9th, we consolidated everything, and we hosted the Inception conference in Riyadh in January 20th. We presented all our priorities, and Japan handed over the presidency to the G20 of Saudi Arabia, and we officially launched. So April 1st was the deadline for the first draft of policy briefs. However, for the newly launched task force, it will be June 12th. We'll make sure we'll get back to all those who submitted abstracts within the next week with a final call, inshallah. And we're expecting to have a first draft in June 12th because we want to discuss the recommendations in the task force workshop we will host from 14th to 16th of June. Every task force will host its own virtual workshop, and these topics will be extensively reviewed within these events. So the second draft for policy briefs is due on 30th July, and we plan on announcing the communique and releasing the communique on the 1st of September. And after that, we will host our T20 summit in 2 days, the 31st of October and the 1st of November. This is a brief overview of the timeline. If you have any questions, please, you can reach out to the T20 Secretariat about this. I would like to thank all the attendees, especially those participating in the chat and those who asked questions. And we apologize due to time limitation, we could not answer everything. However, feel free to reach out to the T20. We can definitely forward these questions and to the panelists for more discussion. A special thank you to our keynote speaker and panelists for sharing their insight and expertise in such challenging time. And I wish everyone a very nice day or night for those joining us from the East. Thank you very much. And with this, I will end today's meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Good day.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Have a good day, all. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. It was nice to meet all of you.
Thank you.
Nice to
Good luck and keep at it. Stay safe.
Thanks, everyone.